My 80-year-old grandfather stood at our doorstep, soaking wet, fishing rod snapped in half, and a $500 fine notice, trembling in his weathered hands. "They threw me out of the lake I've fished in for 60 years, he whispered, voice breaking. "That HOA president called me a trespassing old fool in front of everyone. Little did they know, the deed to that entire lake was sitting in his fireproof safe, untouched for decades." The look in his eyes changed from defeat to determination as he said, "It's time they learned who really owns Sterling Lake." James Anderson, my grandfather, is an 80-year-old retired civil engineer who moved to Lakeview Estates after my grandmother passed, seeking peace in his final years. A quiet man with a lifetime of fishing at Sterling Lake, it was his only remaining joy. His storied past includes designing water systems across 3 states, though few in the community know anything about him beyond his daily fishing routine and gentle smile. I'm Alex Anderson, 38 years old and a corporate attorney specializing in property law, visiting Grandpa after his relocation to ensure he was adjusting well to community living. I never expected to be drawn into a battle that would test both my professional skills and our family's resolve. Victoria Pierce, the 52-year-old HOA president and local real estate agent, has transformed the once friendly community into her personal kingdom through arbitrary rule enforcement and steep fines. Her perfectly maintained appearance and Mercedes-Benz SUV were as much a part of her identity as her reputation for ruthlessly maintaining community standards. What began as a simple fishing trip would unravel a power struggle that nobody in Lakeview Estates could have anticipated, least of all the woman who thought she controlled everything within the community gates. The trouble started innocently enough when I arrived for my monthly visit to check on Grandpa. He had been fishing at Sterling Lake 3 mornings a week since moving in, just as he had for decades before the Lakeview Estates development existed. The small wooden dock where he sat was technically on community property, but everyone used it freely until Victoria noticed him. "She walked by twice yesterday," Grandpa mentioned casually as we had coffee on his porch. "Kept looking at my fishing gear like it was garbage someone had left behind." I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just the usual adjustment period for a new resident. 3 days later, Grandpa called to tell me about the friendly reminder taped to his door about recreational activities requiring prior approval. 40 years I've fished that lake, long before there was a homeowners association, and now I need permission, he grumbled. But being the law-abiding citizen he'd always been, he dutifully filled out the form I helped him download from the community website. Victoria rejected it within 48 hours, citing environmental concerns, despite having approved similar requests from board members' families the previous month. When I called to inquire about the specific environmental issues, she was conveniently unavailable, and her assistant informed me that the decision was final unless appealed at the next quarterly board meeting, 3 months away. The following week marked the beginning of what I can only describe as targeted harassment. Victoria installed a "no fishing" sign directly where Grandpa sat. When he respectfully moved to another spot around the lake, a new sign appeared there within days. "It's like she's watching me through binoculars," Grandpa joked, but I could hear the hurt in his voice. At the monthly HOA meeting, which I attended via video call, Victoria publicly questioned whether certain elderly residents should be living independently if they couldn't follow simple rules. Several residents shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. The implied threat was clear: cross Victoria and you'd become the next target. By midsummer, the conflict had escalated significantly. Victoria started following Grandpa during his morning walks, taking photos of supposed violations with her phone. Everything from improper garbage bin placement to unapproved potted plants on his front porch. The fines began arriving weekly. $50 for landscape alterations when he pruned his own rosebush. $75 for noise violations when he played big band music during afternoon hours. $100 for unauthorized gathering when 2 neighbors stopped by for coffee on his patio. Other residents, fearing similar treatment, began avoiding him in the community center and on the walking paths. His neighbor Frank whispered an apology but admitted, "Nobody crosses Victoria. She can make your life hell here." My cousin challenged her last year about the pool hours and suddenly found himself with weekly inspections until he sold and moved. Grandpa's isolation grew more pronounced with each passing week. The community that was supposed to provide companionship in his later years had become a source of anxiety and loneliness. During our weekly calls, I noticed him becoming quieter, less animated when describing his days. The fishing stories stopped entirely. "Maybe I'm too old for this place," he said one evening, staring out his window toward the lake he could no longer enjoy. That was when I decided to take a week off work and stay with him to better understand what was happening. The day after I arrived, I witnessed the breaking point firsthand. Grandpa had cautiously ventured to the lake early in the morning, bringing along his tackle box but no rod. He just wanted to sit by the water. 8-year-old Tommy Henderson from 3 doors down spotted him and came over, curious about the colorful lures in the box. Grandpa lit up, explaining each one and sharing stories about the fish they'd caught over the years. When Tommy asked if Grandpa could teach him to fish sometime, my grandfather's eyes filled with tears of joy. "I'd like nothing better, young man," he said, pulling an old spare rod from his tackle box. "Here, let me show you how to hold it properly." That was when Victoria appeared, phone already recording as she approached. "Unauthorized gathering and unauthorized recreational activity," she announced loudly, as though reading charges, "and involving a minor without parental consent and proper insurance waivers." Tommy's mother, who had been gardening within sight the whole time, rushed over to protest, but Victoria cut her off. "The rules apply to everyone, Mrs. Henderson. I suggest you review Section 12 of the Community Guidelines regarding liability." She called security, claiming a safety violation, and they confiscated Grandpa's fishing equipment as evidence and issued a $500 fine on the spot. As they escorted him home, Victoria announced to the gathering onlookers that age doesn't exempt anyone from rules designed to protect our community standards and property value. That night I found Grandpa in his study, staring at old photographs, not of family, but of Sterling Lake from the 1950s. "This was all my father's land once," he murmured, tracing the shoreline in a faded black and white image. 40 acres of prime lakefront that had been in the Anderson family since 1872. We sold most of it to developers in the 70s when Dad needed medical care, but we kept something important they never knew about. He pulled out a yellowed document from a fireproof box I'd never seen before, hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it on the desk. Dad was smarter than they gave him credit for. The money was good, but he wasn't about to give them everything. The document was a property deed and land survey, with clear legal language that made my attorney's heart race. "Grandpa," I said slowly, looking between his face and the papers, "do you understand what this means?" For the first time in weeks, the familiar twinkle returned to his eyes. "I might be old, Alex, but I'm not senile. I've held on to this for almost 50 years, waiting for the right moment. I think that moment has finally arrived." He straightened his shoulders, suddenly looking years younger. "That woman thinks she owns everything she sees. It's time she learned a lesson about respecting your elders and checking your property lines." I realized then that the quiet, compliant man who had been suffering in silence wasn't just my fishing-loving grandfather. He was James Anderson, the civil engineer who had overseen water rights disputes across 3 states, whose careful planning had saved thousands of homes from flooding in 1983, and who had apparently been playing a very long game indeed. "What exactly did you have in mind?" I asked, already reaching for my laptop. His answer was simple: justice, and maybe a little bit of well-deserved comeuppance. I spent that night reviewing the documents Grandpa showed me, my legal training kicking into high gear as I pored over the precisely worded clauses and conditions. The original property deed revealed something extraordinary. When his father sold the surrounding land to developers in the 1970s, there was a critical exception buried in the fine print. The lake itself and a 3-foot perimeter around its entire shoreline remained in the Anderson family trust, with mineral and water rights explicitly retained. The developers either never noticed this clause or assumed it was meaningless given the planned community's overall control of the area. For nearly 30 years, the HOA had been operating under the false assumption that they controlled Sterling Lake, placing their signs building their docks, and regulating activities on property they didn't actually own. As a corporate attorney specializing in property law, I immediately recognized the strength of our position. This wasn't just a minor technicality. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of ownership that invalidated dozens of HOA rules and regulations as they pertain to the lake. We contacted my colleague Sarah Jenkins, who specialized in HOA disputes, and arranged a meeting with the county records office to verify everything was still legally binding. The clerk confirmed what we already suspected. There had never been a transfer of the lake property to the developers or subsequently to the HOA. Sterling Lake, the crown jewel of Lakeview Estates' marketing materials and the feature that justified their premium pricing, legally belonged to my grandfather. "We need to be strategic about this," I told Grandpa as we discussed our options over breakfast. "Victoria has built her power on intimidation and selective enforcement. If we're going to challenge her, we need to be absolutely certain of our facts and have a clear plan for how to proceed." He nodded thoughtfully, stirring his coffee. "In engineering, we always say, measure twice, cut once. Let's make sure we understand exactly what we're dealing with." This methodical approach was classic Grandpa. Even in the face of personal injustice, he wasn't rushing to revenge, but calculating the most effective solution. We spent the next 3 days gathering information. Grandpa made a strategic move, contacting his old engineering buddy William Chen, now a county water commissioner. William confirmed that Sterling Lake wasn't classified as protected wetlands or a public waterway, giving the rightful owner significant control over access and usage. "You've been sitting on quite a valuable asset, James," William told him during their meeting at the local diner. "That lake provides the stormwater management for the entire development. If you wanted to be difficult about it, you could charge them for water rights." Grandpa didn't want to disrupt the community's access to the lake, he just wanted to fish in peace, but it was good to understand the full extent of his position. Meanwhile, Victoria's harassment campaign continued unabated. She posted photos of Grandpa on the community message board, labeling him a repeat rule breaker and scheduling a special hearing to discuss his pattern of violations with potential eviction proceedings on the table. What she didn't know was that every additional action she took was strengthening our case against her and the HOA. Sarah advised us to document everything but take no immediate action. "Let her build the gallows a little higher," she said during our consultation. "The farther she goes, the more satisfying it will be when she falls." The day before the scheduled hearing, we received unexpected support from an unlikely source. Frank, Grandpa's neighbor, who had previously been too frightened to openly associate with him, knocked on the door after dark. "I can't stand what she's doing anymore," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder as he stepped inside. "Victoria's gone too far with too many people." He handed us a manila envelope containing copies of HOA financial records showing Victoria had been using community funds for personal expenses, including landscaping for her private backyard, a security system for her home, and even partial payments toward her daughter's college tuition. "I'm on the finance committee," Frank explained. "We're supposed to review these quarterly, but she always has an excuse for these expenditures. When I questioned the landscaping bill last month, she threatened to fine me for my fence height, which has been the same for 15 years. Several other residents, emboldened by Frank's actions, began reaching out quietly. Mrs. Patel from across the street shared how Victoria had fined her for displaying traditional decorations during Diwali, claiming they violated the aesthetic standards of the community. The Henderson Simpsons' parents provided emails showing Victoria had threatened to report them to Child Protective Services for endangering their son by allowing him to interact with an unstable elderly resident. Each story painted a clearer picture of a community held hostage by fear and arbitrary enforcement. The morning of the hearing arrived, and Victoria strutted into the community center conference room with 2 security guards flanking her, clearly anticipating resistance from the troublesome old man. She didn't notice me sitting quietly beside Grandpa, briefcase open with certified documents ready. The room was unusually full. Word had spread that something significant might happen, and residents were curious. Victoria seemed pleased by the large audience, obviously assuming they were there to witness her authority being enforced. "We're here today to address the ongoing violations by resident James Anderson," she began, standing at the front of the room with a laser pointer directed at a slideshow of Grandpa's supposed infractions. Despite multiple warnings and fines, Mr. Anderson has continued to disregard community rules, creating safety hazards and diminishing property values through his actions. She clicked through photos of Grandpa sitting by the lake talking to neighbors, and even one of him simply reading a book on his own porch with his tackle box visible beside him. The board has compiled a dossier of 27 separate violations over the past 3 months, demonstrating a clear pattern of disrespect for our community standards. I waited until she had finished her presentation, letting her fully commit to her position before I stood up. Before we continue, I should introduce myself. I'm Alexandra Anderson, James's granddaughter and legal counsel. A murmur ran through the room as I opened my briefcase. I'd like to distribute some information that's relevant to today's discussion. I handed out copies of the property deed, land survey, and a cease and desist letter prepared by Sarah's firm. Victoria snatched her copy from my hand, scanning it with increasing alarm as the color drained from her face. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, waving the documents. "The lake belongs to the community. It always has." Her confidence was visibly cracking as she looked to the HOA's attorney for support, but he was too busy studying the paperwork with a deepening frown. "This is clearly some kind of forgery or misunderstanding," she insisted. "Actually," I replied, sliding the county recorder's certification across the table toward her, "Sterling Lake has always belonged to the Anderson family. Your developers purchased the surrounding land, but not the lake itself or its immediate shoreline. Every no fishing sign you've posted is technically on my grandfather's property. Every fine you've issued for lake usage is invalid," and I added, placing Frank's financial documentation beside the property records. "We have reason to believe there are significant irregularities in how HOA funds have been managed under your leadership." The room erupted in confusion and excited conversation. Victoria attempted to call for order, but her authority had evaporated in the face of the revelations. The HOA attorney whispered urgently in her ear, his expression grave. Grandpa, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly hushed room. "I never wanted to cause trouble. I just wanted to fish in peace, as I've done all my life. But I won't be bullied in a place that's been my home longer than most of you have been alive." As Victoria struggled to regain control of the meeting, a new question hung in the air. Who really controlled the community that had been built around Sterling Lake? And what would happen now that the truth had been revealed? Word spread through Lakeview Estates like wildfire. By evening, the HOA office was flooded with calls and emails demanding answers and an emergency community meeting. Residents who had suffered under Victoria's regime of fines and threats suddenly saw an opportunity for change. 3 days later, nearly every household was represented as people packed into the community center, spilling out into the hallway and front entrance. The atmosphere crackled with tension and anticipation. For many, this was the first time they'd felt empowered to question the HOA's authority in years. Victoria arrived 15 minutes late, accompanied by the HOA's attorney and 2 board members who remained loyal to her. She had clearly attempted to regain her composure and authority, dressed impeccably in a designer suit with her signature pearl necklace, but the nervous tapping of her manicured nails against her leather portfolio betrayed her anxiety. The attorney, a slick man in his 50s named Gregory Wilson, immediately attempted to take control of the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, standing at the podium with practiced confidence, "I understand there's been some confusion regarding certain property boundaries within our community. I want to assure everyone that these are merely technical issues that don't affect day-to-day operations or property values. The board is reviewing the documentation and will provide a full response at the appropriate time." His confidence wavered visibly when I walked to the front of the room and connected my laptop to the projector. Without asking permission, I displayed the original survey maps, property transfer documents, and recent county verification on the large screen. "For those who weren't at yesterday's hearing, I'm Alexandra Anderson, James Anderson's granddaughter and attorney," I explained, gesturing to Grandpa, who sat quietly in the front row. What you're seeing is definitive proof that Sterling Lake and a 3-foot perimeter around its shoreline have been continuously owned by the Anderson family since 1872. This ownership was never transferred to the developers who built Lakeview Estates, nor to the Homeowners Association that has been claiming authority over it for the past 3 decades. The room fell silent as residents absorbed this information, many leaning forward to study the projected documents more carefully. I continued, maintaining a professional tone despite my growing satisfaction at Victoria's increasingly distressed expression. For 30 years, Lakeview Estates has marketed waterfront properties and collected fees for lake maintenance, dock construction, and recreational management. The HOA has issued rules, regulations, and fines regarding lake usage, all without any legal standing to do so. My grandfather has graciously allowed community access all this time, despite technically having the right to restrict it entirely. Gregory attempted to interject, but I pressed on. Furthermore, in the course of investigating these property matters, we've discovered, concerning financial irregularities, that residents have a right to know about. I switched to the documentation Frank had provided, highlighting specific transactions. These records show that over $30,000 of HOA funds have been diverted for what appear to be personal expenses of certain board members. The projected bank statements clearly showed transfers to Victoria's personal landscaper, home security system company, and even her daughter's college fund, thinly disguised as community improvements and security consultations. Victoria lunged for the microphone, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. "This is a smear campaign. You can't believe this. This trespasser and his conniving granddaughter," she shouted, her voice shrill with panic. "They're trying to take control of our community assets through some ancient paperwork and baseless accusations." She turned to the crowd, searching for supporters. "I've protected your property values for years. I've maintained standards while you all complained about rules that keep this place from turning into a trailer park." Her outburst was interrupted by William Chen, who stood up from his seat in the middle of the audience. "As County Water Commissioner, I can confirm that I've personally verified the Anderson family's water rights documentation. The certificates and deeds are legally binding and have never been superseded by any subsequent agreement." He nodded respectfully toward Grandpa. "I've known James Anderson for over 40 years. He helped design the flood control system that protects your homes from spring runoff. His engineering firm created the watershed management plan that the county still uses today. If you're looking for someone who understands the value and proper care of water resources, you couldn't find anyone more qualified." Victoria's face flushed with anger. "This is clearly some kind of conspiracy. Who are you people to come in and disrupt our community?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for allies but finding mainly hostile or averted gazes. Frank stood up next, clearing his throat nervously but standing tall. "I've served on the Finance Committee for 3 years," he said. "I've questioned numerous expenditures that seemed personal rather than community. Each time I was told to mind my business or face consequences." He projected his own set of documents onto the screen, photos and invoices showing renovations to Victoria's kitchen using HOA maintenance funds, classified as office improvements. Other residents began speaking up, their individual stories forming a damning collective picture. Mrs. Patel described how Victoria had fined her for ethnic decorations during Diwali, while allowing Christmas displays that violated the same supposed rules. The Hendersons recounted how they were threatened after questioning the swimming pool closure during the hottest week of summer, coincidentally when Victoria's family was hosting a private event there. More than a dozen similar stories emerged, each revealing a pattern of selective enforcement, intimidation, and personal benefit. Victoria's face contorted with rage and disbelief as her carefully constructed power structure crumbled around her. "You ungrateful people," she spat, abandoning all pretense of decorum. "I've maintained property values and community standards while you whined about rules that keep this place exclusive. Do you think this community runs itself? Do you think just anyone could do what I've done?" Her voice rose to an almost hysterical pitch. "You'll be begging me to come back when your perfect little neighborhood turns into a fishing camp with boats and tackle boxes littering the shoreline." The community erupted in angry responses, demands for her resignation echoing through the room. Gregory, the HOA attorney, sensing the irreversible shift in power, quietly gathered his papers and edged away from Victoria's side, making eye contact with me to indicate his desire for a private conversation later. The board members who had accompanied her sat frozen, clearly calculating their own culpability and best path forward. In the midst of the chaos, Grandpa slowly stood up, leaning slightly on his cane. Something about his deliberate movement caught people's attention, and the room gradually quieted as he made his way to the front. His quiet voice somehow cut through the remaining murmurs. "I moved to Lakeview Estates because I wanted to be part of a community in my later years," he began, his weathered hands resting lightly on the podium. "My wife Margaret and I always planned to retire somewhere on Sterling Lake. She didn't live to see it, but I thought I was fulfilling our dream when I bought my home here." He paused, looking out at the faces turned toward him. "I never wanted trouble or control. I just wanted to fish in peace, like I've done all my life. To sit by the water my father and his father before him cherished enough to protect with careful legal language that most people overlooked." He gestured toward the property document still displayed on the screen. "This lake has been in my family for generations. The land around it has changed hands. Beautiful homes have been built, and a community has grown. All of which could have been a wonderful thing. We could have worked together all along, sharing the beauty and responsibility of the lake rather than turning it into a weapon to control and punish each other." The simplicity and dignity of his statement seemed to drain the remaining anger from the room, replacing it with a collective sense of shame and reflection. What kind of community had they become, where an elderly man couldn't enjoy a pastime that harmed no one? How had they allowed their beautiful lakeside homes to become a battleground of petty rules and personal vendettas? Victoria stood isolated now, her power evaporated, as residents approached Grandpa to introduce themselves properly, many for the first time despite having been neighbors for months or years. As the impromptu receiving line formed, I noticed Gregory motioning me toward a quiet corner. "This doesn't have to become a legal nightmare," he offered, his tone conciliatory. "The HOA would be open to a reasonable settlement regarding the lake property and other matters." I smiled politely but firmly. "We'll need full financial restitution, a complete board restructuring, and revised bylaws that respect property rights and ensure transparency going forward," I replied. "My grandfather doesn't want to restrict community access to the lake. He never did. But the days of arbitrary rule enforcement are over." The meeting concluded with a vote of no confidence in the current board and the establishment of an interim committee to investigate the financial discrepancies and draft new governance procedures. As we left the community center, Grandpa paused to look out over Sterling Lake, its surface reflecting the evening sky in shades of pink and gold. "Margaret would have liked to see this," he said softly. "Not the fighting, but the coming together afterward. She always said a community is only as strong as its willingness to protect its most vulnerable members." I squeezed his hand, struck by how one man's quiet dignity had ultimately accomplished what no amount of legal threats could have: the restoration of a community's soul. Summer faded into autumn, and the changes at Lakeview Estates unfolded with the changing seasons. Within 2 weeks of the community meeting, the HOA board was dissolved and reconstituted through emergency elections, with strict new rules about term limits and conflicts of interest. Victoria, facing both civil litigation for financial misappropriation and potential criminal charges for fraud, quietly listed her house for sale and moved out before the month's end, reportedly relocating to a downtown condominium where, as Frank Riley observed, she'll have to get used to having actual neighbors instead of subjects. The financial audit revealed even more extensive misuse of funds than initially discovered, with nearly $70,000 diverted to personal expenses over a 5-year period. The new board established a restitution plan that would recover the funds through insurance claims and legal action against the responsible parties. Grandpa, despite having every legal right to restrict lake access or charge for the water rights that the community had taken for granted, proposed a different solution that reflected his character and vision. We established the Sterling Lake Trust, legally designating the lake as a shared resource with an elected community management committee. The trust documents, which I helped draft with input from environmental experts and community members, ensured the lake would remain accessible to residents while being protected from commercial development or environmental neglect. The arrangement gave residents security in their lake access while acknowledging the Anderson family's historical stewardship. It's not about ownership, Grandpa explained during the trust signing ceremony. It's about responsibility. This lake was here long before any of us, and with proper care, it will outlast us all. The new HOA structure represented a complete departure from Victoria's regime, with mandatory financial transparency, term limits for board members, and a resident review process for all proposed rules. Many of Victoria's arbitrary restrictions were eliminated, replaced with common-sense guidelines developed through community input and expert advice. The punitive fine system was replaced with a community mediation approach for most issues, reserving financial penalties only for serious violations that affected safety or environmental protection. We're neighbors, not wardens and prisoners, the new board president stated in her inaugural address. Our goal is to support each other in maintaining a beautiful place to live, not to police each other's lives. As winter thawed into spring, Grandpa supervised the construction of 3 new fishing docks designed with his engineering expertise for accessibility and safety. He insisted on sustainable materials and minimal environmental impact, working closely with William Chen to ensure the structures would serve the community for decades while protecting the lake's ecosystem. The Saturday they opened, we held a community fishing tournament with Grandpa teaching eager children the patience and joy of the sport. Tommy Henderson, the boy who had been there on the day of the confrontation with Victoria, won the youth division, beaming with pride as Grandpa presented him with a new rod. "This lake has given me a lifetime of peace," Grandpa told the gathered families. "I'm glad I can pass that gift on to the next generation." One corner of the lake was designated a protected area for local wildlife, with educational signs explaining the ecosystem and the history of Sterling Lake. School groups began visiting for environmental science lessons, with Grandpa often serving as a volunteer guide, sharing his decades of knowledge about the lake's history, geological formation, and the birds and fish that made it their home. His engineering background and natural storytelling ability made these tours popular with teachers and students alike. "Mr. Anderson explains science better than our textbooks," one 8th grader commented on a feedback form, "and his fishing stories are way more interesting." The healing extended beyond the physical lake to the community itself. Residents who had isolated themselves during Victoria's tenure began participating in events and volunteering for committees. The community center, once dominated by board meetings and violation hearings, now hosted game nights, book clubs, and seasonal celebrations. Mrs. Patel organized a cultural exchange dinner series featuring foods and traditions from the diverse backgrounds represented in Lakeview Estate. The Hendersons established a youth fishing club that quickly became the most popular activity for community children, with Grandpa serving as honorary president and chief instructor. At the 1-year anniversary celebration of the new community governance, residents unveiled a surprise that brought tears to Grandpa's eyes. A handcrafted wooden bench installed at his favorite fishing spot with a small bronze plaque reading, "Anderson Point, where wisdom and patience run deep." The bench, made from sustainably harvested local oak, had been secretly constructed by a committee of residents, including Frank, who had discovered a talent for woodworking in his retirement. "We wanted to thank you for not just reclaiming your lake, but for sharing it with all of us," Frank said during the unveiling ceremony. "You could have used your legal rights to punish the community for how you were treated. Instead, you showed us a better way forward." I watched Grandpa run his weathered fingers over the inscription, tears gathering in his eyes. "You know," he said quietly to me as residents mingled nearby, enjoying the lakeside picnic that followed the dedication, "your grandmother always told me that owning something isn't about control, it's about stewardship. I think she'd be proud of what we've created here." He gazed out over the water, where children were learning to skip stones and couples strolled along the shoreline path that had been restored with natural materials. This is what a lake should be, a gathering place, not a dividing line. As the sun set over Sterling Lake, casting golden ripples across the water that had been in our family for generations, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out. Had Grandpa been a different sort of man, bitter about his treatment, determined to exact revenge? He could have restricted access entirely, charging exorbitant fees for water rights, or even draining the lake, as some angry residents had feared. Instead, his vision of community had transformed not just the physical space, but the human connections within it. Elderly residents who had previously remained isolated were now regulars at community events. Children had safe places to play and learn, and neighbors had become genuine friends rather than wary acquaintances policing each other's compliance with arbitrary rules. Later that evening, as we walked home along the new lakeside path, Grandpa pointed to a young couple sitting on his bench, fishing rods in hand as they chatted quietly in the gathering dusk. "That's the real victory," he said with a smile that erased decades from his face. "Not winning against Victoria, but bringing life back to the lake." The couple waved and Grandpa raised his hand in response, exchanging the easy greeting of people who share something valuable. "Julian caught a 4-pound bass yesterday," he told me proudly, "using one of my special lures. I've been teaching him my old techniques." I glanced at the certified property deed that now hung framed on Grandpa's study wall, not displayed as a symbol of power, but as a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things we own are the connections we create and the legacy we leave behind. Beside it hung a new community award for environmental stewardship, presented to Grandpa by the county commissioners in recognition of the lake preservation program he had established. "From villain to local hero in 1 year," I teased him, referring to how quickly public perception had shifted from seeing him as a rule-breaking troublemaker to recognizing him as the community's most valuable resource. "I was never either of those things," he replied thoughtfully. "Just an old man who wanted to fish and ended up catching something more important than bass or trout." When I asked what that was, he chuckled. "A second chance to make a difference. At 80, you don't expect many of those to come your way." He settled into his favorite chair, the fishing photo of him and my grandmother from 1962 now restored to its place of honor on the side table. "You know what the real irony is? Victoria thought she was protecting property values with all her rules and fines. Since we established the Lake Trust and rebuilt the community, home prices have increased 15%. Turns out people value belonging more than they value restrictions. Who would have thought that an unjust fine would lead to healing an entire community? Or that my quiet, unassuming grandfather would become the catalyst for such profound change? Perhaps the most important lesson wasn't about property rights or legal technicalities at all, but about the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to know what to do once you've won. As Grandpa dozed off in his chair, peaceful and content after a day of celebration, I realized that Sterling Lake had given him exactly what he'd sought in moving to Lakeview Estates. Not just a place to fish, but a true home where he was valued, respected, and loved. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, but restoration, bringing things back to what they should have been all along.